Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, A Clean Energy Bill of Health, a guide to solar for New York schools. My name is Matthew Darius. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator here at New York ASBO, and I'll be moderating today's call. Today we have Aaron Silverman, Project Developer from Borrego Solar, to speak with you. Before we get to Aaron, I just want to inform you of how you can ask questions of Aaron. On your GoToWebinar control panel, which is typically on the right-hand side of your screen, there'll be a question and answer box. If you type in your questions at any time into that box, I'll be notified, and I will make sure to get your question answered as soon as possible. With that out of the way, Aaron, can you please do a brief introduction of yourself?
Great, thanks a lot, Matthew. So my name is Aaron Silverman. I'm a project developer with Borrego Solar, based here in New York. And really for today's presentation, my goal is to give everyone an overview of the solar market in New York and why this could be a good time for you to investigate solar and the different options that are available to you. I've prepared some slides to help me do that, but certainly encourage questions either along the way, or I'm sure we'll have time at the end as well. In terms of the specific topics that I'd like to cover with all of you today, I think we'll start off talking about why solar could be good for your district and why now is a particularly good time to be looking at solar. We'll discuss the incentives that are available at both the state and the federal level, the different flavors of solar net metering that you can choose from, the financing options. A lot of folks have heard about solar power purchase agreements, or PPAs. That's a very common financing model for public sector customers, but there are other options available as well that we'll get to today. Talk about the different types of solar projects: roof mounts, ground mounts, carports. And lastly, the typical timeline for getting a project done, which actually feeds back into the why now question. And again, we'll leave time for Q&A. But before we dive into that, I just want to take a moment to give you a sense of my perspective and where I'm coming from, given what our company does and where we fit into this whole puzzle. So Borrego Solar, we focus exclusively on projects for commercial, industrial, public sector customers. And our focus really is to build projects for those customers. We do all the development, engineering, procurement, construction. We also have an O&M group, so we maintain these projects. And the types of folks we work with, there's actually a number of different stakeholders with whom we'll engage. One would be customers like yourself, who would like to host a project on site, on their own property, perhaps on the roof, or if they have some extra acreage nearby. Because New York allows for off-site projects, we'll also work with customers who either can't or would prefer not to have a solar project on site but still want all of the economic benefits. Related to those off-site projects, we have a program where we'll lease land from private landowners that's ideally suited for solar and can then offer those projects to customers for net metering. And of course, we work with all of the investors who provide financing for these projects. And we've been doing this for quite a while and are the second largest installer in the country right now. With that said, why could solar be a good idea for your school district? There's a few reasons for this. One is that it allows you to take much more control. These are projects that either because you own them or because you're purchasing the power from them, they're your electrons and they're your bill credits. And also they allow you to really hedge against what we've all experienced, which is the tremendous volatility of the commodity markets. I think we all remember, the polar vortex of 2014 and how commodity costs can spike and change without much warning. So this allows you to take control over your own destiny. Oh, and by the way, it also allows you to save money. So especially if done right and you take advantage of all the incentives that are in place right now, we're offering solar PPAs that allow customers to actually save money from day one with no upfront investment. So that's another, huge consideration, I know, for school districts that are always looking for ways to reduce their operating expenses and then, reinvest those dollars into other programs. And there are also great opportunities right now in terms of all of the incentives and regulations, both at the federal level and here in New York, where the Cuomo administration is really trying to focus on growing the solar economy here in the state. There are tax incentives, and there are also state incentives. And by the way, we all pay into those state incentive programs, so it makes sense to go ahead and access those for the benefit of your district. That said, not all of these incentives are going to be around much longer, which gets to the why now part of the discussion. This graph is intended to illustrate the different drivers in the market right now. One is the federal investment tax credit, which has been around since 2006 and covers 30% of the capital costs of a project. That's going to step down to 10% in 2017. You also have state incentives. New York has an NYSUN program that's administered by NYSERDA, and that program is designed to gradually reduce incentives over time. And of course, much has been written. I'm sure you've all read about the radical cost reductions in solar, which is helping to make solar so much more economic today. And we've seen that curve level off today, and in some cases rise a little bit due to some of the import duties we're seeing. But right now is a very good time, especially when you consider that utility rates will, of course, continue to rise. And I think this chart really does a good job of illustrating what we've all experienced. So if you look at this chart, the blue line with the blue dots, that's your average electricity price in New York each year. And the green bars represent the percent change from year to year. So this highlights a couple things. The blue line clearly has a clear upward trend. In fact, costs have risen by more than 35% since 2000. But there's also dramatic swings. And yes, there are some years in which we've seen electric rates go down. That's a common concern when folks are locking into a long-term commitment like solar. But those are few and far between. You know, only 6 years out of the past 23 have we seen that happen. And what's much more common is, of course, the increase in rates over time and some of the dramatic spikes. The beauty of solar is because it's relying on a free resource, the sun. You're not at all exposed to the swings in commodity costs. You're insulated when you invest in solar, either through a PPA or through owning a system. Getting back to the incentives, I mentioned there are a number of different incentives. At the federal level, we have tax incentives in the form of an investment tax credit and also accelerated depreciation treatment for these projects. Now, of course, a public sector entity cannot directly benefit from these tax incentives, but the investors who own these projects and would sell you the energy from these projects definitely rely on these incentives to juice their returns. So, you know, when that investment tax credit steps down to 10%, that'll have a very significant impact on the PPA prices that they can then offer to school districts. At the state level, there's a lot happening. I just mentioned the NYSUN program is called the Megawatt Block Program, and that is currently accepting applications and will step down over time. Another incentive program specifically for school districts, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, is state building aid. Solar is structured as part of an energy performance contract, qualifies for state building aid. And lastly, some of you may have heard of the K-Solar program that's being run by NYSERDA and the New York Power Authority. That's providing technical assistance to school districts in terms of procuring solar, and is another good resource to take advantage of. And what I'd like to do now is just kind of dive into each of these incentives into a little bit more detail. So the federal tax credit, let's assume we're talking about a $2.5 million solar project. Of course, project costs are going to vary considerably depending on how large it is, but this gives you a sense of the import of this incentive. It shaves $750,000 off the cost of this project right off the bat. Yet for projects that don't get done next year, you're going to lose $500,000 of that value, and that could very well be the difference between making money and losing money with solar. So what we're going to see then, and we're already seeing it, is a rush. Everybody's trying to get in line to make sure that they do beat the 2016 deadline for this important incentive. This graphic is really intended just to illustrate a couple things here. One is, you know, those helmets with the wrenches. That represents developers like ourselves, and of course all the subcontractors who are out there building projects. they're not necessarily going to be ramping up with staffing, considering what many people will be a decline in the solar market in 2017, but we are going to see a lot more demand. And so those who lock in contracts with solar developers and installers early have the best shot at locking in slots with electricians and engineering firms, and of course locking in capacity in terms of materials and components. And the later we get into the year, the more risk there is that they won't be available, or that they'll be available at a significant premium. At the state level, we have the NYSUN incentive program. And the marquee part of this program is the megawatt block program. There's a lot on this slide, but let me kind of break it down in terms of all these different numbers. The key points to focus on are that this incentive program has different incentive levels for different parts of the state. There's one set of incentives down in Con Edison, and then there's a different incentive level, a lower incentive level in the rest of the state. The reason why the incentive levels are different are, well, it's certainly more expensive to build projects down in Con Ed's territory, and also it's intended to reflect the proportion to which ratepayers actually pay in to the renewable energy charges on their bills. And so this is how they've decided to allocate the funds into these two different programs. The common thread, though, is if you look at block one, the dollar per watt values are the highest. And then if you move down to block two, they step down, and so on. And there's a certain number of megawatts available in each block, and it's a standard offer, first come, first serve program. Those who apply earliest are going to get the highest incentives for their system, and those who wait will get lower incentives over time. If you're interested, this is not something where you could just go ahead and reserve your funding tomorrow. There's a pretty high bar for entry into this program because NYSERDA really wants to make sure that projects are real and are mature before they allocate funding capacity to them. So specifically, the key the key areas that will need to be completed before you apply for funding. One is you'll need actually a fully executed binding contract with a developer to install your system, and you'll need to have made it through the first step in the interconnection process. So if you were to start today, you'd be a few months out from being able to participate in this program. But certainly there's an advantage to moving quickly to getting the most funding. I mentioned another incentive that's available to school districts, which is state building aid through SED. This would not be available for the third-party ownership model where you're into a PPA. This is only available for energy performance contracting. So in this case, the school district would actually own the system. In doing that, you are forgoing the federal tax incentives, the ITC and the depreciation, obviously, because you own the system. But those are being replaced with state building aid, which I know in certain parts of the state, those aid ratios are very high. And they can actually make the economics look a heck of a lot better than if you were to rely strictly on the federal tax incentives. To qualify for the aid, it does need to be an energy performance contract, so the system has to have a simple payback of 18 years or less. In addition to the potential of actually being a more attractive economic outcome, I think perhaps an even more important factor to keep in mind is that because it does take those federal incentives off the table, the 2016 timing issue is no longer a concern either. And we already are actually seeing some projects, some of the larger ground mounts that we're working on upstate, due to the utilities interconnection schedule, it may be difficult to get them interconnected and operating by the end of next year. So you and your developer could do everything right, and just because the utility interconnection process drags on, you may not have a successful project. You know, if you own the system and you take advantage of the state building aid as opposed to the federal tax incentives, that comes off the table and improves your likelihood of a successful project. So that's the incentive side of the equation. Obviously, there's a lot of really good incentives to take advantage of between now and the end of next year. I also want to take a moment to explain how solar net metering works in New York. There's really two different flavors of net metering. I'll start with the one with which I think everybody's probably familiar at this point, and this is traditional behind-the-meter net metering of a solar project. So in this type of a setup, you have on-site solar. Quite often it's on your roof, and it's installed so that it's behind the utilities meter. What that means is that when the sun is out and your system is generating electricity, the first thing it does is it powers your existing facility, thereby reducing how much you actually purchase from the utility. If you're on a particularly sunny day and perhaps your system generates more electricity than you can actually consume, then that excess generation goes back to the utility, back onto their grid, and the utility has an obligation to compensate you with bill credits for the full retail value of what you pay for electricity. So that's traditional net metering. One of the limitations is that, of course, you're kind of limited to the space you have available. So if you're a larger school district, and let's say you pay enough bills to take advantage of a 1 or 2 megawatt system, but maybe you can only fit 400 kilowatts on the roof, then there's a lost opportunity there by going behind the existing meter. So there's another flavor to talk about, which is really exciting, and New York's one of the only states that allows this, and it's called remote net metering. The way this works is a little different. We'll identify a good site for a solar project. It could be at your facility, on your roof, or maybe if you have extra acreage nearby, we can do it there. Or we can find another site that's ideally suited for solar that's somewhere else within your district's boundaries. We'll build that project. That project will send all of its electricity right onto the utilities grid. It's not tying in behind any existing meters. It's all going back to the grid. But the utility still has the obligation to compensate you with bill credits for the value of all the energy that was generated. There are several benefits to this approach. One is it allows more people to participate in solar than before. Now, even if you don't have a great roof or you'd prefer not to host solar on site, we can work with you to identify another remote site that can generate electricity, and you'll still get all the same economic benefits. Not only that, but it allows us to build a single larger project, and that project, I mean, this photograph kind of illustrates what I'm talking about. You see the gold star, that's a large ground mount system. That's a large ground mount system, and then you have your schools that are located nearby, represented here by the red arrows. That single project can generate bill credits that can then be allocated to all of your accounts. And that allows us to build projects at scale, resulting in greater economies and greater savings for you. You can reallocate the credits every year, so if you open up a new facility, if you close a facility, you can reallocate the credits. It's very flexible. And then the last bullet under these benefits is one that you may have heard some communication over the past months. If you took action before June 1st, then your bill credits will be worth a heck of a lot more than if you were to do the traditional behind-the-meter net metering, or than if you were to take action today. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But that's another huge benefit for doing a remote net metering system, is the additional value of the bill credits from a remote system. And like I said before, even if you don't have suitable land that you control, we can work with you. We can lease private land and then sublease it back to you. So let's get back to this June 1st thing that you've probably heard a little bit about. The Public Service Commission, which governs how the net metering rules work and how the utilities rate their tariffs, they issued an order back in April that's going to reduce the value of these credits going forward. The intent was to eliminate this disparity between what you currently pay for an on-site system, the credits you would get for an on-site system, versus the higher value credits that you would receive for an off-site system. The unintended consequence is that now solar savings are dramatically reduced, and in some cases it won't be economic for you if you did not take action prior to June 1st. The only way for us to know really is for you to work with a developer who can analyze your bills and come up with a custom proposal and see if savings is possible with solar. That said, if you are a school district that did issue a request for information or a request for proposals prior to June 1st, then you're grandfathered under the much more favorable rate structure for solar remote net metering. So let's talk about financing options. I mentioned power purchase agreements. That's a very common financing method, not just for schools, but for all public sector entities that can't directly take advantage of tax credits. In this model, a third party owns the system. That third party has a tax appetite and is able to efficiently monetize the investment tax credit and the accelerated depreciation. And a school district enters into a power purchase agreement. It's a long-term fixed price contract. The term can vary, it's negotiable, but it's typically between 20 and 25 years. So it's supposed to match the approximate life of the system. That's a very popular option, but if you want to own the system and perhaps take advantage of the state building aid, you can issue bonds. There's a federal clean renewable energy bonds program that actually provides assistance with the interest payments if you go that route. And of course, there are leases, with which I think you're all familiar. And with that, I believe we have Holly Andriozzi on the phone from Bank of America. Holly, if you're there, I think it probably makes sense for you to talk through a little bit some of the most common leasing terms.
Sure. Yeah, I'm here. I'm Holly Andriozzi from the Energy Services Group at Bank of America. As many of you know, tax-exempt leasing is a widely used financing mechanism for energy performance contracts. Many school districts in the state of New York have used this to fund those contracts. This is also a mechanism as an alternative to finance solar projects. You know, just like in the energy performance contract, with a solar project, a lender would get a security interest in the equipment. In this case, it would be the solar panels. The school district would retain title and be the actual owner of the solar panels, and as Aaron pointed out, would be able to get the benefit of building aid on their project. These transactions are subject to annual appropriation. They have very competitive interest rates. Most school districts will use a financial advisor and go out and get multiple quotes from lenders. So it is a competitive process, and the rates are very competitive. The typical term that we see for leases tend to be 15 years, although some folks may try to go a little bit longer to 18 years. But 15 is what we typically see, at least on the energy performance contract side. With the tax-exempt lease, you know, at closing, the money is placed into an escrow account. Interest is earned and invested on behalf of the district and to the benefit of the school district. And the money in the escrow, it's drawn down to pay for the project. And once your project is fully paid, the escrow account is closed. The benefits of leasing for a solar project are, you know, very low cost of capital. The school district owns the asset, so there's no buyback provision. You don't have to buy it back in the future. You own it on day one. And, you know, it's subject to building aid. So I believe building aid will apply to these particular leases. The cons, if you will, about using a lease on this structure is there are no tax incentives. The 30% ITC, as Aaron pointed out, is replaced with building aid and no depreciation benefits. I would just like to make one other comment. Aaron talked about the clean renewable energy bonds, CREBs, if you will. In order to use CREBs, you have to apply to the Treasury to get an allocation. And I believe Treasury has allocations available at this point in time. We at Bank of America can finance a CREB through a leasing arrangement. So even though it is called a bond. You can finance a CREB in many different ways. And I'll turn it back to you, Aaron.
Great, thanks a lot, Holly. So let's talk a little bit about where you can put a solar project. Everybody's familiar with rooftop solar. One of the nice things about it is that you don't need any extra land, and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But on the other hand, there are certainly limitations. You need to have a roof that's the right age. Your project size is going to be limited to the available roof space, which may not actually be the size that a district really needs to offset their utility bills. Another option is to do a ground mount system, either on adjacent land or other sites that a district owns, or off-site land. If it's off-site, it does need to be within the geographic boundary of the school district. The benefits here are the ability to build larger systems benefiting from those economies of scale. On the other hand, since it is a larger project and is ground mounted, there is a bit more of a complex permitting and interconnection process, so you'll want to get started earlier with those types of systems. And then lastly, there are solar support structures, or also known as carport structures. It's a great way to use, a large parking lot without having to deal with kind of the roof integrity issues. It's a nice amenity in terms of the shading. The major downside, and the reason we really don't see much of this in the Northeast and in New York in particular, is the cost. It's about 50% more, compared to a roof mount or a ground mount. And so usually there's a more cost-effective way to get solar done. With that, I figured I'd just show you a few pictures so you can kind of visualize what we're talking about in terms of rooftop solar on a couple of different school buildings. This is a ground mount right next to an existing energy consumer. And of course, there's really getting off-site in terms of just using open land that is not necessarily where your facilities are. Will be generating electricity that goes back onto the grid, and then you get bill credits on your existing utility bills. And lastly, the carport structures, which are definitely more popular out in the West Coast, where rates are higher, subsidies are higher as well, and so they can withstand the extra costs. Just want to finish with a look at the timeline. Let's say you say go tomorrow and you want to get a solar project done. I think the big thing that jumps out at you is that long bar, the second bar from the top, the utility interconnection process. That's the big wild card. That process can take quite a long time, and we're seeing a big rush on the utilities that are struggling to keep up with all the interconnection applications that have been submitted on behalf of customers around the state. So that's the process. That'll be the limiting factor. That'll ultimately determine whether your project gets done next year or it doesn't. And so you'll want to start that as early as possible. So if you go back to the beginning of the process, of course, you'll want to issue an RFP to satisfy public procurement requirements. Let's say that whole process, including the contract negotiations, takes 3 to 4 months. As soon as you're at the point where you're ready to award the project to a vendor, before you even have a signed contract, once you've chosen your horse in terms of the vendor you're going to work with, that's the point when you're going to want to ask that vendor to apply for interconnection. You want to get that process started as early as possible to ensure the highest likelihood of success. Then while that's going on, of course, there's all the engineering and permitting work. We've heard about permitting delays at SED. We've also heard that Carl Thurnow is working with NYSERDA to augment their resources and try to get through the permitting more quickly. The actual construction period itself on site is about a 3 to 4 month process depending on the size of the system. So again, this really, I think, highlights more than anything the need to get started soon if you want to have a project that's going to be completed next year. And in some cases we are unfortunately seeing projects that are going to be pushed to 2017. So that's all I had prepared, but I would certainly love to respond to any questions you may have for me, or if Holly's still on, questions about leasing. So Matt, I'll turn the mic back over to you.
Great, thank you. If anyone has any questions for Aaron, please go ahead and type them into the question and answer panel. Usually it's on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. All right, Aaron, looks like you did a great job because we have no questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. I will be posting the video and the handouts on School Business Connect if you'd like to view it again in the future. Aaron, thank you very much, and everyone have a great day.